Breaking news to get to: the legendary singer Ozzy Osbourne has died. That is according to our partners at the BBC. His death comes just weeks after he reunited with his former band Black Sabbath for a farewell concert.
There are moments in music history that stop the world cold. The kind of news that travels faster than any headline, that hits you somewhere deep before you even finish reading the sentence. When the name Ozzy Osbourne surfaced alongside the word autopsy, the world paused. Not because it was entirely unexpected. Those who had followed his final years knew the body of the Prince of Darkness had been waging a long private war, but because nothing about Ozzy Osbourne was ever supposed to end quietly. He was the man who cheated death so many times it almost seemed like a gimmick, a part of a legend. And then it wasn't. What emerged from the clinical language of the official post-mortem examination wasn't just a cause of death. It was a full accounting of a life lived at maximum velocity, one that had been paying the price in silence for far longer than anyone realized. The disturbing details buried within that report have since sparked conversations among fans, medical professionals, and rock historians alike. Because the story the autopsy tells isn't just about how Ozzy Osbourne died. It's about how hard he fought to stay alive and what that fight actually cost him. To understand what the autopsy revealed, you first have to understand the extraordinary physical and psychological burden Ozzy Osbourne carried into his final years. Born John Michael Osbourne on December 3, 1948, in Aston, Birmingham, he grew up in a cramped household with 5 siblings, a factory working mother, and a father who pulled night shifts as a toolmaker. Poverty, undiagnosed learning disabilities, almost certainly dyslexia and ADHD, and relentless bullying shaped a young man who felt invisible to the world. Music was the only door he could find that opened. He found his people in Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward, and together they became Black Sabbath, a band that didn't just pioneer heavy metal, but essentially invented it. Ozzy's vocals were unlike anything the genre had produced before, eerie, melodic, capable of conveying genuine dread and genuine anguish in the same breath. Albums like Paranoid and Master of Reality weren't just commercial successes. They were cultural seismic events that rattled a generation raised on optimism and sold them something rawer and more honest. But the stage version of Ozzy Osbourne, wild-eyed, bat-biting, unpredictable, was only half the story. The other half involved a body and mind that absorbed decades of punishment. Alcohol and drug addiction consumed his 20s and 30s. His firing from Black Sabbath in 1979 sent him into freefall. His solo comeback, anchored by the brilliant guitar work of the late Randy Rhoads on Blizzard of Oz, rebuilt him. But the lifestyle continued. Every high came with a physical cost. Every tour left another scar. By the time Ozzy Osbourne stepped on stage for his final Black Sabbath performance in Birmingham on July 5, 2025, seated on a throne, visibly frail, but vocally unmistakable, his medical history read less like a biography and more like a war report. The most catastrophic single event came in January 2003, when he suffered a near-fatal quad bike accident at his Buckinghamshire estate. The crash fractured his collarbone, 8 ribs, and a vertebra in his neck. He was placed in a medically induced coma. Medical staff were uncertain whether he would survive, let alone walk again. He did both, but the injuries left permanent damage. Metal rods were inserted into his spine. Nerve pathways were disrupted. Chronic pain became a daily companion from that point forward. In 2019, a fall at his Los Angeles home shifted those same spinal rods, requiring emergency surgery. The recovery was brutal and prolonged. Touring plans were scrapped. Ozzy spoke openly about the agony, describing it in one interview as the worst pain of his life, which, given everything he had already endured, was a staggering statement. In the aftermath of that fall, he underwent additional procedures to address complications, and by some accounts, the total number of surgeries on his spine and neck across his lifetime exceeded a dozen. Then came the diagnosis that, in many ways, reframed everything that had come before. In January 2020, Ozzy publicly confirmed what his family had known since 2019. He had been diagnosed with PRKN2, a specific variant of Parkinson's disease linked to a genetic mutation. It progresses differently from the more commonly known form and can interact with other neurological conditions in deeply complex ways. The tremors visible in his hands, the cautious and shuffling movements the public had been watching for years, they were never simply the effects of age. They were symptoms of a disease that had no cure and showed no mercy. According to sources familiar with the contents of the post-mortem examination, Ozzy Osbourne's official cause of death was recorded as respiratory failure, a direct complication of his advanced Parkinson's disease. This is consistent with how Parkinson's often claims lives in its later stages. As the disease progresses, it attacks the muscles involved in swallowing and breathing. The body's ability to breathe effectively diminishes, and pneumonia or aspiration complications frequently become the terminal event. For those who had monitored his decline closely, this finding was heartbreaking but not surprising. The Parkinson's had not been manageable. It had been relentless. But the cause of death was only the headline. The disturbing details that emerged from deeper within the autopsy painted a far more complete and unsettling picture. One of the most distressing findings documented in the examination was evidence of significant chronic malnutrition. By the time of his death, Ozzy's weight had reportedly fallen below clinically healthy levels. The examination noted visible deterioration of muscle mass, what medical professionals refer to as sarcopenia, along with signs of connective tissue weakening, likely attributable to a combination of neurological decline, reduced mobility, and the long-term effects of his many surgical procedures. Parkinson's disease itself contributes to weight loss and malnutrition through several mechanisms. The disease affects the muscles used in chewing and swallowing, making eating difficult and sometimes dangerous. It disrupts the digestive system, slowing gastric emptying and causing nausea. And perhaps most insidiously, it diminishes the appetite through its neurological effects. The brain's reward signals around eating are dampened, making patients far less inclined to eat even when they are technically capable of doing so. For Ozzy, a man who had already subjected his body to decades of substance abuse and surgical trauma, the cumulative physical toll documented in the autopsy was severe. The autopsy also documented the extraordinary internal evidence of a lifetime of physical trauma and surgical intervention. Partially healed scar tissue from multiple spinal and cervical procedures was noted throughout the examination. Areas of persistent inflammation were identified around surgical sites, an indication that even at the time of death, Ozzy's body was still attempting to recover from injuries and procedures that had occurred years, and in some cases decades, earlier. Chronic inflammation of this kind carries serious consequences well beyond what is visible on the surface. Persistent systemic inflammation is associated with cardiovascular strain, compromised immune function, and worsening neurological symptoms. For someone already battling an aggressive neurological condition, inflammation of this severity would have compounded every other challenge his body was facing. The sheer number of surgical interventions documented was, according to those familiar with the report, striking even to medical professionals accustomed to reviewing complex cases. Each procedure, however necessary at the time, leaves behind scar tissue, potential nerve disruption, and changed internal architecture. For Ozzy Osbourne, this accumulation amounted to a body that had been structurally altered many times over, and that was paying the long-term price in full. Perhaps the finding that generated the most discussion among those who reviewed the autopsy was contained within the toxicology results. No illegal substances were detected. This was entirely consistent with Ozzy's public narrative of long-term sobriety from alcohol and recreational drugs, a recovery he spoke about with genuine pride, given the depths from which he had climbed. What the toxicology screen did reveal, however, was the presence of elevated levels of prescription opioids and sedative medications. The concentrations were within the range associated with long-term pain management for severe chronic conditions, not indicative of misuse, but clearly indicative of a pain burden that required substantial pharmaceutical intervention simply to make daily life bearable. This is a clinical reality for many patients in the advanced stages of Parkinson's disease combined with chronic spinal injuries. The medications required are significant, and they carry their own risks, including effects on respiratory function, which, given his recorded cause of death, carries a particular and sobering resonance. The autopsy findings, read in sequence, tell the story of a body managing cascading systems of failure, each one connected to the next, each one requiring intervention that introduced its own complications. Beyond the physical findings, those who were close to Ozzy in his final months have spoken carefully and with evident grief about the changes they observed in him. The withdrawal that set in during the final stretch was notable to those who knew him well. Studio time, for decades a sanctuary, a place where he felt most himself, became infrequent, then rare. Conversations grew shorter. The man who had spent 50 years giving everything he had to audiences around the world was, by all accounts, turning inward. Those who loved him interpreted this, understandably, as exhaustion. The fatigue of a man who had fought for so long that the reservoir had simply run low. And they were not wrong. But in retrospect, those closest to him have quietly acknowledged that what they were witnessing was also something more final. A man who had made peace with what he had accomplished. A man gradually releasing his grip. He had, after all, done what he set out to do. That final concert in Birmingham, the city where a bullied, dyslexic kid from a working-class family had first heard the Beatles and decided he wanted to be part of something bigger, was everything. He sat on that throne, and he sang, and the voice was still his. Trembling, yes. Older, certainly. But unmistakably, irreducibly, completely Ozzy Osbourne. The crowd that filled Villa Park didn't come to watch a man perform. They came to stand in the presence of someone who had meant something real to them. Someone whose music had been there in the dark hours, in the moments when nothing else made sense, in the years when being different felt like a curse, and Ozzy's entire existence argued back that it was not. Among the details that have circulated in the aftermath of the autopsy report, one stands apart from the clinical findings entirely. A single handwritten page, reportedly found on the nightstand beside his bed, written in his own shaking hand. Not a formal farewell. Not a theatrical final statement from the Prince of Darkness. Just a few quiet, unadorned words. I've done enough. For anyone who knew his story, the boy from Aston told he would amount to nothing. The man fired from the band he helped build. The addict who climbed back from the edge. The patient who refused to stop performing even from a wheelchair. Those words carry the weight of an entire lifetime. He had done enough. More than enough. He had sold over 100 million records, won Grammy Awards, and been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice. He had launched Ozzfest and given a generation of bands a platform when the mainstream industry refused to. He had made reality television human and strange and real. He had spoken publicly about addiction, about Parkinson's, about the terror of a body falling apart, because he believed someone out there needed to hear the truth from someone who had actually lived it. The disturbing details of Ozzy Osbourne's autopsy report are disturbing precisely because they are human. There's nothing mythological about chronic malnutrition, about inflammation surrounding old surgical scars, about a toxicology screen that documents the pharmaceutical scaffolding required to keep a broken body functional. These are the details of a real man, not a legend. A man who paid in flesh and bone for the extraordinary life he chose to live. But they are also, in a strange and important way, a testament to something that goes beyond medicine. Because knowing what the report describes about the state of his body in those final months, the fact that Ozzy Osbourne sat on that stage in Birmingham in July 2025 and sang those songs one last time is not diminished by any of it. It is made more remarkable by all of it. His voice gave pain a language that millions recognized immediately as their own. His presence gave outcasts permission to exist loudly and without apology. His honesty about addiction, about fear, about the vast distance between the person the world sees and the person living inside a failing body, was in the end the most powerful thing he ever offered. Not the theatrics, not the mythology, not the bat, the truth. Ozzy Osbourne is gone. The amplifiers have gone silent in the way they only do when the person who charged them with meaning is no longer there to fill them. But what the autopsy ultimately confirms, underneath all the clinical language and all the medical detail, is that the Prince of Darkness was, above everything else, stubbornly, defiantly, and magnificently human. And he never stopped fighting until the very last moment.